In this video, we're going to be looking at some lactate curves and some lactate data from a couple different tests that were run by Angelo. Angelo is a triathlete that I've worked with in the past, done a full physiological profile with him, and more recently, he redid the test by himself, taking lactate measurements using Moxie, and he asked me to have a look at the data that he collected. So we're going to do this together today. First, we're going to look at his lactate curve that he had on his first test, his initial test with me, and the interpretation there. And then we're going to look at his new lactate curve and his interpretation of said curve. And then finally, we'll compare the two, superimpose them on the graph, and look at them together. So without any further ado, let's dive into it. So here we see his initial testing data, and that was his initial lactate curve. From the first test. So we started a 4-1 protocol 41, starting at 8.5 kilometers an hour, increasing by 0.8 every step, 4 minutes of work, 1 minute of rest. The lactate was taken at the end of every work stage, 4-minute work stage. So we see we had a plateau here at the beginning around 1.1, and I usually take active baseline plus 0.5 for the first threshold, which put us back then around 11.7 kilometers per hour for threshold 1, going from 1.1 to 1.6 or 1.5 here for the first one. And then the second threshold that was determined with the Moxie with the modified Dmax as well was around 14 kilometers per hour. With a lactate value that was fairly low here at 3.2, and a fairly good looking curve. With if I remember correctly, the main recommendations was to spend a bit more time, maybe a little bit closer to threshold 1, and accumulate some time around here, as well as doing some medium intensity tempo threshold type of work to push the curve to the right a little bit more. So now let's look at the data that he sent me more recently. So he redid the test using my collection, my sheet to collect the data. So again, started at 8.5 and then went up 0.8 kilometers per hour every step, like we did in the initial test. Here are his lactate values. Here are his RPEs. Leg RPE and global RPE and a respiratory RPE, and those are good units to have, in my opinion, to check what you've done with your interpretation, and to also link perception to physiology, which is often a bridge that we haven't built, but we should be building. So those are his data that he collected on this retest. He did tell me he was not in the same shape as he was when we tested him the first time, because now it's the beginning of the season and he's just getting going with training. So the results aren't going to be as good, quote unquote, in terms of performance, but that's fine. We're just here to look at the data and interpret it. So once we plug all that into the sheet, we come out with this curve right here. And so, like I said, first threshold analysis, I'll usually use baseline, active baseline, which here's 1.7, here's 1.6, if I'm not mistaken. And then it goes to 2.2, 2.2, 2.6, 3.1. So baseline here, if we want to be, 100% in line with what I said, active baseline is 1.7 plus 1.6 divided by 2, which would give us 1.65. And then plus 0.5, that puts us just a little bit above 2, so 2.15, which is very close to the 2.2. So conservative Sean would be tempted to put your first threshold at 10 kilometers an hour. I think we can safely put it between 10 and 11 kilometers an hour. Definitely no higher than 10.9. Because even though RPE is still very low, we already see that first inflection in lactate. We actually see it a little bit before, but I think somewhere between 10 and 11 is completely reasonable in terms of interpretation. And remember, it's always better to be a little conservative on the interpretation than to be a little ambitious and then train too high, because the whole purpose of this test is to not train too high. So even if you have to train lower than you wanted or hope that you were going to, but then in 2 months you just do a quick spot check and you see that things have moved and you can train a little higher, then go for it. No problem there. Interpretation for threshold 2, we have the modified Dmax from XPhysLab that gives us 13. We have RPE 8 that is usually fairly aligned with threshold 2. Here we're high, 14.2. And where does the curve start going exponential? same. We were around 13 kilometers an hour. So I would probably put threshold 2 around that, between 13 and 13.3, if we want to put it on that one here. And what's interesting is that you can see the lactate values are higher than what we had in the initial tests thresholds at threshold 2, which is probably just the symptom of less training over the last few weeks and months. And now that he's starting the season again, he's going to accumulate volume, and that lactate curve is going to drop. So I would do between 10 and 11 on the first threshold. Honestly, I'd rather be conservative and put it at 10, even though it hurts the ego a little bit. And then the second one, I would put around 13, and I would work from that. But if you haven't trained for a little while, you can probably expect some returns on that pretty quickly. And maybe in 8 weeks, you need to shift things to the right a little bit and see how things evolve. So that would be my interpretation. Now we can look at the comparison between those two graphs. And we see those two curves here. Interesting, the heart rates for the initial test in blue and for the retest in red, which are fairly similar all the way through, except we didn't go quite as high on that retest, one step less than on the previous test. And obviously the lactate curve that has quite a different shape to it compared to that first one that we had measured. But it's interesting to see them superimposed like this. It was interesting to look at the Moxie as well and look at the change in trend from stage to stage. And we can definitely see how 1, 2, 3, 4, between step 4 and step 5, the trend during the work interval. Let me see if I can actually annotate this and draw a little line for you. So let's draw a little line. Let's make it green so everybody can see it. So what I like to look at is the trend here, and we can see that those are fairly straightforward. They're going up, and here we're starting to shift to something that's a little more plateau-ish or plateau-esque. And here we clearly have a negative trend towards the bottom. So that's how I would look at the Moxie data for this retest in regards to checking what I did in terms of the lactate interpretation itself. I still think that we need to be conservative as always with those interpretations, and it's better to be a little bit too low than it is to be a little bit too high. Looking at the curve here, you could almost say that the second threshold is probably going to go up more around that 12.5, right? It's starting to increase a little bit earlier here, or at least the moment where the two curves start shifting apart from each other more significantly is definitely at that 12.5. So 13.3 might be a little bit ambitious. But again, going back to the XPhys lab data that gives us 13, I think we'd be good to put at 13. So 10 and 13 would be my interpretation for the updated thresholds here, although conservative, right? For a more aggressive interpretation, you could say 11 and 13.5 or 13. I wouldn't go much past 13, honestly. And I think that's a good place to start. And then from there, like I said, check every few weeks and then see how things evolved. So here you go. Here's my feedback on the lactate data. Thanks, Angelo, for sending your data over. Looking forward to having a chat with you. I know you had some questions, so we're going to do that in the coming days. And hope this video was useful for people interested.